My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and of course the collected poems of J.R.R. Tolkien came out several weeks ago, and I never announced that I got it, but of course I got it because, yeah, it's it's a brand new thing for Tolkien, and that's kind of what I get for birthday and Christmas and stuff anymore is Tolkien stuff. And that is the subject of today's video. Before I get into that, I did want to mention I do have a request from an Elf Frontier patron to do a video on things that Peter Jackson got right in the Hobbit movies. That will be coming. Normally, whenever I get requests, I like to do those as soon as I can. In this case, it means I'm going to have to watch the 3 Hobbit movies. So it's going to be a little while before I can actually get through all of that and do that video. But it is on my to-do list, and it will be coming. It's just a matter of time. So I just want to make sure the person is aware that, yes, I am going to be doing that. It's just going to take a little while. That said, let's actually get to the subject of this video, which is the collected poems of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, there's a lot to say about this. I have not actually read all of it because, it only came out a few weeks ago. I have not had time to read that much stuff, okay? But I have read enough to know basically everything there is to know about the book, aside from reading the exact details about each different poem that is collected in the book. And of course, it's a 3-volume book, but you get my point. So basically, what is the book? So it's not all the poems Tolkien ever wrote. It's not that. So if that's what you're expecting, you might be disappointed. But they did do a lot of, and by a lot of, I mean, I think they collected at least some version, if not every version, of all of Tolkien's previously unpublished poems and put them in this stuff here. So if you've never read a Tolkien poem before because it's just not been available to the public, it's probably in here. I'm not sure they got exactly every single poem that matches that description because it's really difficult to say whether we've gotten everything that Tolkien didn't publish because he wrote so much that's in different places. But they have had access to Christopher Tolkien's papers. They've had access to stuff from Marquette University, the Bodleian Library, I think they even mention. So there's a lot of material that they went through, and they describe in their introduction, which, by the way, is rather long itself. Their introduction is over 60 pages. They talk about the history of this book and how they were kind of commissioned by Christopher Tolkien to do something about Tolkien's collected poems because he thought that it should be something that was available to the public because he wanted his father's, skill and history as a poet to be more known. So there's an element here of this is almost in a way Christopher Tolkien's last kind of posthumous gift to the world in one sense, because he's the one that started this process, but it took so long that, of course, he's died in the interim. Now, the work itself, like I said, is a lot of Tolkien's poems. Some of them have already been published before. They actually do give in this book portions of a few of, but not all of, the poems in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, for instance, and some from the Silmarillion, or the Silmarillion-related material, such as the Children of Húrin, those kind of poems. So there's stuff in here that will be familiar to people who already know Tolkien's writings really well, but of course there will also be things that nobody has seen before, really. And apart from just the collection of the poems, they also dive into the history of them, because in most of these cases, there are a lot of versions of these poems that Tolkien, he adapts and reworks them and does a lot of things with them over time. And one of the things that comes with that is he, a lot of the time will leave notes. And if you've read any of Christopher Tolkien's History of Middle-earth series, you will know that one of the things that happens in those is Tolkien we'll have a version here, and Christopher will give that version, and then he'll do some notes about it and talk about how it subsequently developed, give some of the next version, and on and on and on. Now, of course, in those works, Christopher Tolkien is giving long passages of prose in a lot of cases, and so there's a lot more of it in one sense. Here, a lot of these poems are much shorter, and so you get, whereas Christopher Tolkien might give just some of the prose passage that differs from the earliest version, which he gave in full, here we're getting kind of the full versions of poems over and over again, in the shorter cases at least, because some of them were so substantially changed as to make it almost a completely different poem, and the poem itself is not so long that you would have a problem reproducing, the poem a whole second time, because it's not huge. Now, some of the poems, of course, are much longer, and they're not going to give us the full versions of, the children of Húrin over and over again. That's just too much. But they do give histories in very much the same way as Christopher Tolkien does of the development of these different writings. And you could be forgiven for thinking in reading this that you're just reading a Christopher Tolkien work about his father's poems, because it's very similar in the kind of style that Christopher gives his father's writings in the History of Middle-earth series. He, will tell you notes about, well, here's where I think this started because of this note and this date and whatever, and then this seems to have developed here in this year, and, that kind of stuff. They do very much the same kind of thing. So it's not like every page in this book is just one poem after another for you to just read the poetry. You can, of course, do that if you want to skip all the historical, stuff in the middle between different versions of the poems. So if that's what you're interested in and that's all you want, there's no reason you have to read all the other stuff. But it is there for anybody interested in the historical development of the poems. Besides the main poems themselves, of course, like I said, there's like a 60-something page introduction, and a lot of that introduction is describing the history of how Christopher Tolkien kind of commissioned them to do this work, them, finally figuring out how they wanted to present it, some of the history of Tolkien as a poet. They talk about a lot of different things in this introduction. That after the introduction, they also give what they call a concise or brief chronology, which is, compared to the introduction itself, it is rather brief. It's still several pages, though, and it's basically a chronology of when Tolkien wrote poems, when he updated poems, and some other major events in his life to kind of give some context for what's going on in his own world that might, play on how he's writing these different poems. So there's that if you're interested in that kind of a context for the poems as well. Once you get past that, you start getting into the poems proper. And then, you'll usually get like an introductory note, then you'll get the poem, and then again, you'll get the historical information about how it develops and more versions of it, if there are more versions of it. And there are, if I remember right, 195 collected poems in here. Now, they're not, again, all complete, because some of them they're only giving partial versions of them, because some of these poems have been published in full form by Christopher Tolkien or others in other places. And of course, in Lord of the Rings, you get full versions of a lot of different poems as well. But the ones that have not been published before, I think they've pretty much done the entire versions of, because they kind of decided, well, it would be a real loss if, given this opportunity, we didn't at least publish the stuff that's never been seen before. In addition to all of that, there are several appendices which have different things. So Appendix 1 is limericks and clerihews that Tolkien wrote, and that appendix is only about 6 pages, so it's not like a huge number of those. The next one is Latin adages, which is another 6 pages or so. So again, not a huge number, but these are much, much shorter, so you can fit more of them on a page, so there's still a fair number of these. Then there are poem lists, and these poem lists are lists that Tolkien himself came up with and a lot of it is stuff where he was considering publication of poems, and therefore he's putting lists together of what he might publish together and that kind of thing. And so again, this is kind of more for contextual information if you're interested in it, not necessarily inherently interesting in and of itself. Then there's a words list in Appendix 4, and then Appendix 5 is interesting. Appendix 5, I'm not sure I can pronounce this properly, but it looks like Bialuerig, which I think this is Old English, and it appears to be, I have not read the whole thing, but it appears to be an Old English and also Modern English translation, sort of the Lewis Carroll poem Brillig. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, the first line is "'Twas brillig in the toes." And if you still don't know what I'm talking about, it's something worth looking up, because it's really interesting reading. It was the idea behind it, as I remember, because I did study it a little bit in high school, I think, was to basically write a poem with a bunch of nonsense words, which nevertheless gave the impression of being intelligible. And so you think you know what the poem's about, even though you don't know what any of the words are. But this is kind of Tolkien's attempt to recreate that in his own way, which I'm really tempted to skip ahead and just read that one, because it's the idea of it is so interesting. But that's the last appendix, and then there's also a glossary of words that would be unusual or archaic that people might not know the meaning of, so there's that as a helpful reference. And they also include a bibliography and an index, and there's also several illustrations scattered throughout, which, there's also just really interesting art on the fronts of the books as well. And these are, this is art by Tolkien himself, so it's rather fitting. The books themselves are, well, let's just say, magnificent. I mean, this is the kind of binding that you want in a really good hardcover. It's got its own, ribbon bookmark. It's got really, really nice hardcover. I mean, they're just absolutely gorgeous books. And there's, of course, 3 of them. And they are, they've got, you probably saw, but they're, the type is kind of what you would expect from a History of Middle-earth type book. It's about that size, so not overly large, and we're talking hundreds and hundreds of pages. In fact, if you look at the table of contents, the book is numbered as if it's all one volume. So when you finally get to the index at the very end, the index starts on page 1473. It's a lot of paper. It's a lot to read, which is why I said I have not read it all yet. There's just too much. But the books themselves are absolutely gorgeous, and of course it comes in a very nice slipcase. I mean, what else would you expect in a thing like this? Now, of course, there is the element of expense, because a triple volume hardback like this is not going to be cheap. It was something that Christina Scull and Wayne Hammond put a huge amount of work into, I have to imagine. And so you're not going to get this for a small amount of money. If you want to shell out and get this now, you're looking at 3 figures probably, unless you can get really lucky. If you're going to wait for it to get cheaper than that and hope they put out a paperback, whether that happens is anybody's guess, because this is not the kind of thing that I think is going to be hugely popular for just public consumption. But, it could happen, obviously. So, and even the ebook is, from what I understand, just as expensive as the hardback, pretty much. So, I mean, you're going to spend some money if you want to get this. But if you're into Tolkien's poetry, and I am, or if you're just really interested in the History of Middle-earth series type analysis of Tolkien developing things that he's written, this is, of course, an invaluable resource for scholars on that note. It is extremely useful for anybody who just wants to know more about Tolkien's poetry. The one, like I said, kind of, I didn't say this earlier, but disappointment is that it doesn't have all Tolkien's poems. It would be nice if we had a volume which literally had every poem he ever wrote just in one spot without necessarily all the historical stuff. I mean, you could do without that to save paper and cost. But, we don't have that. So if you want to have every single poem he ever had written or published anywhere, then you're going to have to buy more than just this set. And of course, that in one way adds to the cost of it, because if that was a thing that you wanted, this is not it. And, if you're the kind of person that's buying this, though, you probably already own most of his other collected poems, because you probably already have the History of Middle-earth series, you probably have all this other stuff. That said, of course, this is a lot of poetry that many people have never seen before, and it's a lot to read. And even if you read just the poems, there are, I believe it is 195 numbered poems. Let's see, table of contents numbers them, yes, through 195. And that is a seemingly small number, but it's a deceptively small number because they are also giving multiple versions. And just as a simple example of that, the very first poem in the book, there are 2 or 3 different versions given of it, and they're very, by the time you get from the first version to the latest version, very different poems. They're not, it's not like he's tweaking 1 or 2 words here or there. I mean, he kind of substantially rewrites the whole thing. So yes, it's 195 numbered poems, but each one of those is inclusive of every version of that poem, which some of the versions of the poems seem like totally new poems. So don't let the 195 seem so small that it's insignificant and be like, that's not really enough for my money. No, there's a lot more there than you think. So there's quite a lot of poetry in the book, much more than just 195 poems. There are probably 2 to 3 times that number when you really look at the substantially changed versions of each one. So, obviously, whether the book is worth getting is entirely dependent on your budget and, how much you like reading Tolkien's poetry, or how much of a, just a collector you are, whatever it is. But the point being, whether you want to get it or not is entirely up to you. What I will say is the books themselves, as I said, are absolutely gorgeous. The illustrations are quite nice. Just the poems are nice. Now, you're not going to get Tolkien at his best in every poem, obviously, because some of these poems date back to as early as 1910. And, this is before he really, really developed his skill at poetry. And of course, the other thing about poetry is Tolkien wrote in so many different styles. He wrote in rhyming couplets. He wrote in Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse. He wrote in all manner of poetic forms. And if you're not a particular fan of some of those forms, you're not going to be a particular fan of some of those poems that he wrote in those forms. Just, speaking from my own personal experience, the first poem in the book is of a type which I am not really a huge fan of. Call me, whatever you like, but I really like the rhyming couplet style of the Lay of Beren and Luthien. I also really like some of his alliterative verse, especially as he got really good at it. If you kind of read it out loud and really let the rhythm carry you, it's really fun to listen to some of those in your head or out loud. But I like the rhyming stuff too, and I don't like some of the more modern styles of poetry that sometimes he engages in that are not as poetic in the sense that, just your average layman typically thinks of what poetry is. Most your average layman, when they think poetry, think in terms of something rhyming, if not rhyming couplets. You've got Shakespeare's sonnets and things like that. And there's a lot of poetry that he wrote that is neither alliterative nor rhyming. And, that's just one of those things where I've never developed a taste for that. So, it's not something that I'm particularly into, but people who are just into poetry general will, of course, have all kinds of fun with this, precisely because there's so many, different kinds. And that's another thing that they talk about in the introduction, is the fact that Tolkien experimented in all these different forms, which made him kind of different from most of the people of his time who were writing. They were either writing in the traditional forms that came within the generation before, or they were all trying to do something new to differentiate themselves from that. Tolkien did whatever sounded good to him, and he liked stuff from all kinds of different forms, and they talk about that. And there's representatives of pretty much everything in this volume. So, definitely a massive, massive undertaking and a huge boon to the Tolkien world for everybody who wanted to read more of Tolkien's poetry. And it's, again, each individual person may not be able to shell out the money to actually get this thing, but, at least now that it's out there, some of this poetry is definitely going to work its way into the broader public conscious, because, it's just bound to happen. So even if you don't feel like you can afford to shell out for these things, hopefully somebody does, and you can at least share in the experience that way, because there's a lot in here. And, even if you're not a fan of his poetry, in some of his poetry, you'll find reading it interesting, because you'll see the kinds of things he was thinking about and the kind of poetry he wrote, as just an interesting look into another facet of this guy that we all love reading. And that in itself is an interesting experience. So that's my review of the collected poems of J.R.R. Tolkien. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope it was informative. If you haven't already picked up the book, of course, I hope it helps make your decision one way or the other if you were considering it. If you did like the video, please do give it a thumbs up, share it around, make sure you subscribe to catch all my future content, and if you're on YouTube, click that bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions every week, and check out other support and social links in the description below. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour, Robert Kindling, Stephen Clayton, and Spud.